So welcome to this panel on civil society, civilizations and foreign policy, bipartisanship or dead end. We are going to have a rich panel with speakers from the UK as well as from Italy as well as Brussels. We're starting with Maurizio Carbone from the University of Glasgow, who is going to end together with me shared paper on Lia is from ISPI, which is a think tank in Milan. What is left in foreign aid, the partisan politics, and the search for a development policy in Italy.
Okay, I'll go. Thank you for inviting me. So what we have now, we have it's not a full paper, so we have get already to Pasquale and to the organizers. It's a work in progress. We was responsible because there are a number of issues that prevent us from doing a full paper. So we have so take this as a number of random thoughts, random, as much as random as you want to take that. So the starting point of this is the following: like every year there is a large quantity of foreign aid given to developing countries. So that was in 2011 was 134 billion. So it's a massive amount, and the starting point is that aid we consider is still an important element in international relations. True, FDI remittance play a role, but we stick to the fact that foreign aid does play a role, especially for small countries. On the other hand, the starting point is that European Union members have done a lot to keep it alive, and Italy has been continually shamed for its poor performance. So that's the question here. So when we ask what's foreign left, what's left in Italian foreign budget? What's left means that when you ask these questions, say there's nothing. What do we discuss? There's nothing to explain. And I can ask people that question and say, sorry, what are we talking about here? Because most of the Italian aid is done multilaterally, so there's not much bilateral aid. So the other starting point is that it's an interesting discussion, because we can start from 1994 and we say what's left in foreign aid, meaning that the conventional wisdom is to say that there is a clear difference, at least if we look at the literature, between the right and the left in foreign aid. So is Italy again an anomaly in this? Because what I've said myself, what we've seen since 1994, we've seen a sort of bipartisan failure in dealing with the development policy. So, and we look at the literature, what we've done, we look at the literature, and strangely enough, we try to go in this literature, in the literature review, which actually draws a lot from development economics, we try to go against some stereotypes, saying that there is a role for partisan politics in foreign aid, because the starting assumption of most studies is that treating the state as a unitary actor. So in a number of studies, they looked at the impact of domestic politics, find partisan politics has not been considered as an important element. Of course, those who are older than me remember the studies by Lumsdain, by Stocke, Wang, and Terrien and Noel, who looked at this dimension and said, well, that's not necessarily true. Political parties do play a role. So we will go and look at the literature, and we try to have, first of all, a definition of what the left wants, in line with what what we're trying to do in this conference, and say, what does it mean to be left-wing? And the left-wing says that foreign aid is a moral obligation for wealthy countries towards poorer countries, to alleviate global poverty and promote economic, social, and political development in the South. Aid is consistent with the role of the state in the economy, pursuing egalitarian outcomes. Aid is seen as an extension of the responsibilities of the welfare state on the global scene. Foreign aid can help when market mechanisms fail, such as the provision of global public goods in developing countries. And the left tends to emphasize the benefits of foreign aid rather than the cost. And for the left, foreign aid significantly contribute to progress in the developing world, and thus aid should be increased. So that's what the general view of the left is. Of course, there are a number of discussions here that we can have. But there is one quote by this guy Terrien, which has written a very interesting book about the left and the right in global politics, published by Cambridge University Press. And they say that there is a tension between the right, which tends to see aid as charity, and the left, which tends to see aid as an entitlement. So that's one of the starting points for us. And then we try to look at this and we see, does this rhetoric translate into policies? And what we've done two things, which we'll say in a little bit. Whether or not this rhetoric translates into policy outcomes. We've looked at party manifestos on the one hand. We would like to look at party manifestos on the one hand, and also the approval of this famous law, which has been discussed for the past 20 years, more or less 17 years. And every time it is a sort of discussion about the meaning of left wing. The discussion, however, our starting point is the following. There is a sort of generalization that the left tends to increase foreign aid. We say, well, that's extremely simplistic, and we've seen in the paper, which will be available sooner than later, we try to see at a number of possibilities. And we say the following: it's not necessarily true that the left wing gives more aid to developing countries, but what we can see is, what we're going to test are the following hypotheses. Does the left give more aid to low-income countries and to least developing countries? First question. Does the left give more foreign aid for a certain type of sectors, looking in particular at social sector rather than productive sectors? Third element, does the left give untied aid more than the right-wing governments? Fourth question, does the left give more aid in terms of grants rather than loans? Of course, we understand these are some starting hypotheses, but we are going to test a number of alternative hypotheses. And we're going to say, are there alternative explanations to the role of partisan politics? And what are this role of alternative hypotheses that we're going to try to test? One of them is, for example, polarization. How divided is a government, and how divided is the opposition? So that's a central element which we're going to see, because we tend to see that if the government is more divided, that's the starting assumption is that it can be beneficial for foreign aid, because some minor parties can pursue their own development policy and then sort of threaten the coalition in power. Another alternative hypothesis is about independent agency. Do countries that have independent agencies give more or less foreign aid? So in reality, it's the presence of an independent agency which is the key factor, because otherwise we can only see a sort of incremental, bureaucratic incrementalism, and the presence or absence of an independent agency ensures more or less continuity across different governments. Finally, the economic crisis, which we're going to see, and then I'll give the economic crisis and economic crisis. Does the economic crisis have an effect on the left more than it has on the right wing? Because we expect the left being caring much more about redistributive policies, then is less interested in foreign aid in period of hard times. And then we have a number of other alternative approaches which concern peer pressure and the role of international organization. We expect the foreign left, especially in Italy, which has always been interested in a more European dimension, to listen more carefully to what the European Union has been saying over the past decades. LIA is a more difficult job to, in the second part of the paper, which is actually where we try to test these elements, where, as I said, we're still at the initial stage. Go, Lia.
Well, this is a standing panel because actually I'll have to show you some pictures. Of course, there is a difference between left and right, along to what Maurizio was saying. Of course, the left wing in Italy has kind of tried to say that it's more altruistic than the right wing. And so we had some kind of titles to the periods where left wing and right wing were in government. Between 1994 and 1996, we had a period of an attempt to privatize aid for the first time. The idea of private agency outside the control of the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Then between 1996 and 2001, in the general attempt by that government to bring Italy back into Europe, there was an attempt to use multilateral channels rather than mainly bilateral channels, and to do a push to follow some of the big multilateral efforts at the global level. One for all, it's the effort for debt relief. Then we had, again, a shift in government between 2001 and 2006, and we had a kind of renationalization of foreign aid with an attempt to reform the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in order for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to promote Italian interests abroad and make development aid part of this attempt to have ambassadors as ambassadors of what is called Made in Italy, for example. And then we had a brief parenthesis, again, of left wing, when the left wing tried to align Italian development cooperation with international norms, standards, and targets, because in the previous legislature and in the previous right-wing government, we had a really bad performance in terms of international targets. Italy was lagging behind, and it's the first time when, between 2001 and 2006, that Italy really said that it couldn't comply with international targets in terms of aid quantity, not even quality. And then we had the last period of Berlusconi, which was 2008-2011, when really Italy was declared to be a laggard, not only in terms of quantity, but also in terms of quality. And then we had this small parenthesis, 2012-2013, which we are still in, which is this kind of grand coalitions governments, which we cannot assign a specific color. But what we did in order to see whether there is a difference between left and right, and so to see whether the left has some specific characteristics, is to just plot very, very easily the years in governments and the coalition. So you see the red lines are the lines where left wing was in government, and the blue lines where right wing was in government. And the gray lines are kind of governments that we cannot qualify as left or right specifically. And in quantity, measured in different ways, you can't really see a difference between left and right, measured as ODA, excluding debt relief, because we were following some kind of major push at the international level. Also measuring ODA as a percentage of GNI. So you can't really say whether the left wing has, at least in this first stage, we didn't find a real characteristics of the left of being more altruistic in the face of providing more resources to aid. And then the second thing we did in order to test what the literature was saying is to compare the instruments. So whether the right wing, which is a more privatized, which follows a more privatized use of aid, uses bilateral channels, while the left wing, which should abide by international norms, standards, and go along with international campaigns, uses more multilateral channels. And here again, you can't really tell a difference. Of course, there is a problem because we have elections coming at kind of in spring. So some years, for example, I don't know, 2008 is a year that is influenced very much by what happened in 2006 and 2007, which were years where Italy really tried to make a push in joining some multilateral efforts, but at the same time you can't really tell the difference between the two things, the two sides. The third thing is to see whether what's the aim of development aid, whether we used instruments that help promoting Italian interests or poverty reduction. And so we had a look at sectors. And here again, you can't really tell a difference between sectors that are more towards private sector leaning and more towards national interests channels, which is economic, infrastructure and services, and production sectors, or more traditional sectors for poverty reduction like social infrastructure, education, health, and so on. You can't tell a difference between left and right. And the last thing we did was to see whether the way we used aid, so whether we used aid tied to procurement of Italian goods and services from Italian enterprises or not. Of course, here we have a big problem of the data, but you can't tell a difference again between left and right in using or refusing to use tied aid. So there are some dimensions that were not tested. There is, of course, a problem with the data because you have some years where left or right-wing governments kind of overlap in their attempt to do policy. But our tentative conclusion, and we would like to hear from you whether we can test other dimensions, how you would show this kind of relationship, is first of all that we can speak of a bipartisan failure more than anything else. So I'm almost done. There is really budgetary constraints weighted more than anything else in deciding what kind of aid policy could be done in these years. The left didn't stand outside of the rhetoric and outside of continuous attempt to reform a law that was not yet reformed, and this is due to two things. On the one side, on the dire states of the Italian public finance, and on the other side, on the absence of a true development constituency in Italy that kind of pushed the reform and can be identified as supporting either the left or the right. So this is our tentative conclusion, and we really would, being a work in progress, we really would like to hear your opinion and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you. Inviting now Raffaele and Rocco and Fabio. Maybe you can, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I'm reassured by your presentation. I thought I was going to present something very different from you, Maritza and Ian, but it seems we ended up on a similar line. I discussed different issues, but one of the arguments that I think is important in my paper is about bipartisanship. So in a way, it's in line with you. The other thing I have to say before I start, this is a paper I already published. I'm sorry, I was planning to develop it further, but it's not. I will, because I'm writing a book on this, on civil society and government and their synergy in Italian foreign policy. So every comment is really welcome for my future work. So the aim of this paper, and more in general on my research, is to provide a more comprehensive understanding of Italian foreign policy. How I do that? Well, I look at the role played by the synergy and the collaboration and cooperation between the Italian governmental foreign policy, classically understood, and the action carried out by Italian NGOs in different domains, but especially looking at the domain of human rights. I'm very happy that Pasquale Ferrari is here because he's actually an important actor in the action, in the practice of this. So, and actually my research came also out of a long chat we had some time ago. And the result of this, it's an image of, I call it a bit like provocative normative power Italy. There is a story that I think we need to reckon here about the impact, the influence of in Italian foreign policy on reshaping, generating new norms that have to do with human rights at the international level. And this result is achieved through the synergy between governments and non-governmental actors. And I think this is important. I mean, it's a reassessment, if you want, of Italian foreign policy. Traditionally, Italian foreign politics has been considered kind of a business, a governmental business only. This is the classical image, perhaps with some exception, the so-called famous Eni diplomacy and other kinds of instances, but usually it's a governmental, classically understood. But of course, the context in which we live is very different. Pluralist global governance, in which both the state is disaggregated, the story told us by Anna-Marie Slaughter is very well known, but also non-state actors are more and more important in the dynamics of global politics. Both private actors, for-profit, multinational corporation, and other kinds of business lobbying groups, and of course non-governmental actors. So in that sense, we need to sort of enlarge a bit the focus to understand what actually really happened there, also in the Italian case. So there is a gap in the traditional literature about Italian foreign policy, but there is also a gap in the literature about Italian civil society. Traditionally, those who have studied civil society organization, NGOs, not-for-profit sector, I mean, different kind of names, have tended to look at civil society in a competitive relation with the government. The idea of contentious politics. We need to sort of criticize, we need to put pressure, we need to formulate demand of accountability toward the government. This is the classical image that in a certain strand of literature, and of course also in practice, is present. However, there is also an image, and this is the image I look at in my paper, not about competition, but about cooperation, in which governments and civil society do cooperate, do create a synergy that manage to have achieved important results at the international level. Of course, this also means looking at specific kinds of civil society organizations. Some civil society organizations will not, of course, by nature in a way, because of their political project or because their ideological orientation, will not tend to cooperate very much with the government. Others will do. And so, of course, this is already, you see, I mean, a criterion for selection of the NGOs or civil society organization I have looked at. So my idea is to make these two strands to talk. Foreign policy analysis, Italian foreign policy analysis, Elisabetta is here, of course, and many of you, and civil society organization, civil society or social movements literature. And these two needs to talk. In fact, what we need witness in the Italian case is, as much as in many other cases, I'm not arguing about the uniqueness of it. In many other cases, there is a synergy between government and NGOs, and we see it everywhere. I mean, think only about democracy promotion policies, of course, and public diplomacy. I mean, this is government plus NGOs working together to pursue foreign policy objectives. NGO or development policies is also another sector. And why this happened? Because both gain from it. Government gets credibility and expertise from NGOs, the civil society organization get funding and entry point to diplomatic circles. The transformation of the system itself, in a way, encouraged this creation of hybrid coalition. What is not clear is under what condition this synergy occurred. Not only the Italian case, more in general, I look at the Italian case and then I aim to generalize this. I formulate 6 hypotheses, conditions under which this synergy is more frequent. Readiness of government to provide funding to NGOs, bipartisan support, left and right needs, at least in the Italian case, have supported those policies, those successful policies. Hybrid coalition beyond the national government with European Union, with pieces of international organization, parts of UN and other kinds of organization, other governments, transnational coalition not only between the Italian government and Italian NGOs, but also other transnational networks and other international organizations, issue resonance. You promote a norm, you try to change a norm at international level, that this has to resonate with a kind of Italian deep public opinion. This is the case of death penalty, for instance. And soft policy sectors, this is more controversial. I looked at 4 cases for the moment. The peace process in Mozambique, led by the Sant'Egidio community, 83-92. The ICC, the campaign that led to the drafting and the statute of the Rome Statute in 1998 for the creation of the International Criminal Court. The campaign that led to the moratorium passed by the UN General Assembly in 2007 on death penalty. And more recently, the campaign that led again to another decision voting by the General Assembly banning the female genital mutilation. And the last 3 campaigns have been carried out very much by the Radical Party, but not exclusively. This is another important issue. If we take, for instance, death penalty, there you find Amnesty International in Italy, Sant'Egidio, and Partito Radicale, the 3 working together. I mean, this is important. It's a kind of trans-ideological coalition building. It's very important. What the results are of this research, if we look at the specific cases about the human rights, i.e. death penalty and genital mutilations, we found these 6 hypotheses confirmed. And beyond those conditions, we find specific Italian factors, which we need maybe to reflect together more on. The hybrid nature of the Radical Party. Yeah, it's a party, but then it's, if you took hands-off Cain, it's an NGO, formally speaking, and it's in between. The presence of the Vatican and the Christian network, very important. Death penalty in many countries, under pressure from the Vatican and the Christian sort of networks, changed their position in favor of the moratorium, or even altogether the abolishment of death penalty. The close relation by now between civil society and government. Think about Emma Bonino or Riccardi. I mean, 2 former ministers coming from, and then even now we have a junior minister again from Sant'Egidio. I mean, by now there is a kind of strong revolving door policy in a way. High level of participation of Italian civil society organizations. There is a general trust. 1 out of 3 Italian, according to statistics, is part somehow of an NGO. And then, of course, Italy middle power position that, in a way, helped to reject the suspicion of neo-colonialism, but also push Italy to use to strengthen the collaboration with the EU and to use soft power. With this, I conclude. I mean, it seems, from what I understand from my analysis, that at least in the field of human rights, cooperation with government sounds like a necessary, not sufficient condition for civil society actors to have an impact at the international level. It's important the ability to navigate the international, transnational, and local context. NGOs need to be able to do that. And finally, the image of normative power in Italy. It is very clear, from my understanding of those cases, that without these kinds of synergy between the Italian government and Italian civil society organizations, those kinds of results, the moratorium about the death penalty, the FGM ban, would have been more difficult to achieve, would have been achieved later, or maybe would not have been achieved at all. So in that sense, there is a story to tell about Italian normative power that I think we need to grab. Thank you.
Now we have Rocco Polin from the Istituto Italiano di Scienze Umane, who is talking about the foreign policy of a center-left administration, Milan, and the preparation of the ESC.
If anyone is able to do this. Good morning, everybody. As anticipated, my paper is about the foreign policy of the city of Milan under the center-left administration of Giuliano Pisapia. And so in writing the paper, I had to keep in mind 2 sets of questions. One about city diplomacy and the growing role of global cities, the international relations of local administration, and so on. And the other one, of course, is the topic of the day, is the relationship between the Italian center-left and foreign policy. I think the case of Milan is interesting in both respects. It is interesting in the first respect because Milan is, of course, probably the only truly global city in Italy, with all due respect to Rome. And because, of course, in 2015, it's preparing to host the Expo, so one of the main international opportunity for Italy. It's also interesting on the other respect, on a more political ground, because, of course, the victory of the center-left in 2011 was a major political event in Italy, kind of anticipated the end of the long Berlusconi era, and was immediately perceived as an important test for the ability of the left to govern also the international dimension of Milan. My analysis is, my paper is divided in two parts. On the first part, I analyzed the so-called expressive activities, so those declaration or policy decisions that do not immediately affect the life of the city nor the international arena, but serve mainly a purpose of taking a stand on some pressing global issue or foreign policy problem. And I have three cases in my paper. The first one is about the attitude of the vis-a-vis administration and the center-left majority on the Arab-Israeli conflict, with the international visit of vis-a-vis at Bethlehem and Tel Aviv and the discussion that followed in the City Council. The second one is about defense policy, all the heated debates about the purchase of the F-35 jet planes and more general discussions about the role of armed forces in the conduct of the democratic foreign policy. And the third case is about human rights, the balancing of human rights defense and realpolitik, in the case, for instance, of the Dalai Lama visit to Milan, or the suspension of the twining ties with St. Petersburg after the passing of homophobic laws in Russia and so on. The second part of the paper is more concerned with the work done by the administration in managing Milan's international dimension. So the international dimension of local policies, of sectoral policies, is the work done in multilateral networks of cities, and of course the preparation of Expo. And I think one of the main things that, of course, comes up from the analysis, from the interviews I conducted in Milan, is that even at local level, the political color of the administration is by no means irrelevant in the conduct of international affairs. And in the sense, the Democratic Party has some weaknesses and some strengths for sure. And I think one of the big strengths of the party is basically it seems more ready compared to its immediate predecessors of the center right to manage the complexity of the nexus between the international and the local. And the work done on European funds, the work done on sectoral internationalization of sectoral policies, on city twinings inside the networks, clearly goes in this direction compared to kind of a more narrow-minded and I would say also short-sighted vision of the center-right, who kind of seemed to fear the negative externalities of globalization, but was not really keen on seeking the opportunities that the internationalization process offers. And also the work done on Expo, on kind of presenting Milan as a global, using the platform of Expo to present Milan as a global hub on international discussions on nutrition, on global development, is a work that I think it's clearly in line with some of more recent academic discussions, for instance, on mayors governing the world, and also with the work done by London, for instance, in using the Olympic Games to kind of lead the discussion on environment and climate change. Of course, at the same time, there are also clear weaknesses, one of which is still immature and ideological positioning on some topical issues. And even in the case of Expo, is very evident by what I call the attempt of the administration to kind of disguise Expo, to frame Expo, which after all is a global fair event, that's what it is, a global trade fair, into something like a new version of the Flora Social Forum, which I think it shows a worrying tendency of following some of the most radical constituencies of the left, particularly at a rhetorical level, ideological level, at the price sometimes of a diverging path between the rhetoric and the policy decisions. And of course, in the debates in City Council over the Arab-Israeli conflict or over the role of armed forces, again, it's clear and evident that some of the problems that have hindered the action of the center-left governments in the past few years with the Unione coalitions are still there. Not much has been done to solve them. I would say that one worrying tendency is by part of some of the Democratic Party officers to delude themselves and thinking that the problem was only linked to the presence in the coalition of small leftist radical parties, while the discussion in Milan, I think, show that some of the division run deep also inside the Democratic Party. And so, and also, very often the kind of this ideological polarization is very much linked to widespread lack of factual knowledge, which is perfectly understandable since we are talking about a locally elected political class who was elected to manage Milan and not the international relations. But at the same time, it's all the more worrying now that the internationalization process clearly affects also very local decision taking in Milan, from sectoral policies to construction of the mosque, and you can mention so many. One of the reasons of hope, I think, is that this kind of situation has pushed to the forefront of internationalization an unprepared political class, but at the same time may be forcing locally elected officers to socialize themselves with foreign policy and to go through a learning process about foreign policy issues before they go on to take more heavy responsibilities at national level. So this internationalization of local administration may serve as a venue for a learning process. And indeed, most of the interviewed officers have highlighted some learned lessons from avoiding lengthy ideological discussions and focusing on more deliverable projects on the nexus between internationalization and local policies, to even kind of treat foreign policy seriously and understand it has some peculiar characteristic. It must be treated very carefully and of course be used as an arena to score easy points on the domestic level. So, and I'm going to conclude, I would say that looking from the Milan case, compared to the Italian center-right, particularly the center-right in Milan as we knew it before this administration, the center-left is well placed to understand some of the key challenges that are brought about. This internationalization process on one side, the disaggregation of foreign policy in different levels and with different actors, which I think is one of the main things that is happening now in foreign policy, that the monopoly over foreign policy enjoyed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is clearly gone. And so the center-left seems able to understand some of the challenges that go with it, and particularly to work to make this internationalization process an opportunity and not only a challenge. At the same, and again, as I said, the fact that the internationalization of local administration may be useful to learn in this respect. At the same time, the Italian left is still struggling with some problems. The problem we saw at national level is for me the discussion about the role of armed forces in our foreign policy is clearly one of the main discussions that the center-left needs to have and has not done properly. And in this sense, I think that the new leadership of Matteo Renzi and the Minister Mogherini that we've been talking today, they are breaking some of the taboos. They are kind of setting a new path for the Italian left. This is about time that they also engage in foreign policy. And I think this is one of the reasons why the discussion here today has been particularly interesting. Thank you.
Now we have Fabio Petito from the University of Sussex on foreign policy and religious engagement, special case of it.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. So, my brief presentation, which is going to be really a collection of some tools that is far away from the stage of even being possibly called a draft of a paper. It's going to be on a topic which might not be really appear immediately as relevant to the discussion we are having today. And it's the topic of religion and foreign policy. As a title, it's about the tentative argument hypothesis that I want to suggest is that with Italy, we are facing a special case for this connection. Now, I do my remarks in three parts. I'll give you a little bit of the context to understand why we even at the moment decide to discuss the issue of religion and foreign policy. Then I'll move on and I'll explain why I think Italy is a special case. And finally, I say something about how I think the left has something to say about these issues of religion and foreign policy. Now, the context. The context is, and here is the following, that it has been 20 years, I would say, that in the last 20 years, finally, that the international relations foreign policy community has come to the realizations that religion had been completely forgotten as a relevant factor in international affairs for many years. The reasons are many, mostly secularization as the framework of our social and political thinking, a particular idea of religious violence. But in the last 20 years, finally, there's been an acknowledgement that we need to recognize that religion does matter in international affairs and foreign policy, and that actually the foreign policy community has not been prepared enough to deal with this issue. This concretely, I think this movement is taking an interesting trajectory, especially in the United States, where much of this work started to be done in the mid of the 90s. The first book was Religion: A Missing Dimension of Statecraft. It's taken an interesting development, and to cut a long story short, through a number of academic interventions, in 2006 we reached a point in which Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State, said, well, in the book she wrote about the mighty and the almighty, she said, I don't know why as a Secretary of State I have all sorts of advisor on climate change, trade, and I don't have an advisor on religious issues. And then to cut a long story short, this was taken very seriously by the foreign policy American community, and in 2009 a working group on religion and foreign policy was set up, and in 2013 a unit for religious engagement was created within the Department of State, and therefore now there is a US policy on what it means for the American foreign policy to engage with religious community and religious leader abroad. All this, of course, intersected with 9/11, but the idea is that religion actually opens up a much broader set of issues important for diplomats. Now, European countries have been doing more recently similar initiatives, and here, I mean, I'm very happy because there are two people who have contributed quite importantly to this. First of all, Pasquale Febrara, when head of the policy planning unit, he organized small initiatives of yearly seminar on religious and international relations to raise the awareness among the foreign policy community about these issues. And also Sarah, more recently, has been one of the key forces in actually putting together a transatlantic dialogue on this issue of religious engagement in foreign policy. So, now, that's the kind of interest from which I'm coming from, which is in many ways very practical. Now, why I think that when we discuss about religion and foreign policy in Italy, we are facing a special case. And what's special about that? Well, what's special about that, probably what you will find in many of the diplomatic historical accounts of Italian foreign policy here and there, or different comments and analysis, has to do with the overwhelming presence of the Vatican, Holy See, the papacy, the Bishop of Rome, and its role in terms of influence on Italian foreign policy. I would say that what struck me is that there is quite a lot of references en passant in different analysis on this, but actually there isn't a proper analysis of this topic of the Vatican and Italian foreign policy, which I think will make for a fantastic PhD thesis. If anyone is here, you know, I think that would be simply terrific. You know, the references are very scattered. Things, you know, during the liberal period of Italian foreign policy, Italy was with the Triple Alliance because they were the Catholic powers and the Vatican was pushing for it. Or during the fascist era, there it was about the Concordato. I think probably the fascist era is the only time in which you actually have quite a lot about Italian foreign policy and religion because of the Concordato. You can find some analysis. Then you have, you know, let's say, what about the influence of the Vatican in the emerging Cold War, pushing the Christian Democrats, introducing De Gasperi to the Americans. You know, these sort of references are quite common. And even in the post-Cold War era, you know, you might find journalists or analysts saying, well, you know, the problem with the Balkan War was that the Vatican put all this influence on the Italian government and German government to get the recognition of Croatia, and that led it. I'm not saying that this probably might have been the case. What I'm saying is, the first point is there is this uniqueness of the Vatican, of course, and the presence in Italy, but I think it hasn't been dealt properly in terms of analysis. But the uniqueness, for my view, is something more specific, which has to do with, first of all, the very unique structure of the Catholic Church as one of the great worldwide religious traditions. The uniqueness has to do with the fact that, differently from all the other great worldwide religious traditions, Catholicism has a very relatively hierarchical structure, which cannot be found in Islam, cannot be found in any of the other Asian major religious traditions. And that hierarchical structure, to some extent, goes to Rome. However decentralized it is, because I think it's not only so vertical, it's actually much more dialectical, because national churches are very important, and there is a kind of so there is this very important dimension. The other very important dimension is actually that it's not only a reality, the special case of Italy is not only to do with the church as an institution, it has to do with actually the church as a network, not the church-inspired networks of religious associations, organizations, institutions, which in Italy is pretty remarkable. By any account of mainstream sociologists of religion, Italy is unique in Europe for the thickness and density of the fabric of religious civil societies in all its articulation. And there are very solid and robust data to prove that. For example, Garelli recently, the sociologist of religion, has also published some very interesting stuff on this, also available in English. So I think this societal dimension and strength of societal dimension of the Catholic Church is very important. There are two other points which I think help us to make the full picture, and that Catholicism is not anymore a European religion, or a mostly European religion. We are now, and it has been for some decades, facing a religion which is globalist in nature, which is, most of its believers are actually in the so-called global south, and that's a very major shift that is, you know, it has happened in the Catholic Church, you know, with all tensions and resistances, but that allows actually the network that the Catholic Church represents to have a very different dynamics. You know, I was very interested by this sort of picture that you put on the things from Rome, all this kind of hub and spokes, which is true. You know, the largest arrow, of course, in the case of Italian foreign policy, goes to the United States. As of course, it makes sense. Left, out, and left. Well, no, that's right, Elizabeth. But what is interesting is that actually this is, you know, of course, a network, diplomatic, you know, representation makes the network speaks very well. But this sort of network speaks very powerfully for the Catholic Church in the sense that, but here the major arrows that are actually nowadays going towards the global south. It's Latin America, it's Africa, and to some extent it's even Asia. So why are you mentioning this? Because I think this is one of the major, actually, this is a major sociological change in religion, which is reflecting a major geopolitical change that is happening. Because I need to conclude why. I just want to say a few things about the left and the Italian foreign policy. I think I was enlightened on this topic after, and I say this very honestly, I've read Elisabetta magisterial book on Italian foreign policy, which finally, thanks to Elisabetta, we have a proper treatment of Italian foreign policy through the toolkits of foreign policy analysis, and not mainstream foreign policy analysis, highly original and innovative tools. And so I was struck by how much she explained that there was, Italian foreign policy was indeed this result between the interconnection between domestic and international politics. And I think that speaks very strongly also for the topic I'm actually talking about. But there are a few things in which I think it's interesting to think in terms of the left. First of all, if the issue of religion in foreign policy raises understandable concern in terms of the secularity of politics and understandably some anti-religious resistance, I want to stress that this was indeed very present, but it was not the left who was the strongest representative. It was the liberal elite of the so-called liberal foreign policy elite. Not only because of the well-known fight between church and state in the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century, but also because of this, because of it. But let me say, this did not actually avoid that the elite of the liberal foreign policy was using, for example, the prestige projected by Catholic missionaries, such as Franciscan, often in the debates over foreign policy as a key kind of channel for the projection of the Italian power in the Middle East. It's documented in the parliamentary debate. 2 minutes and I'll finish.
No,
I can't. Okay, so I'll go just okay. I'll just go by bullet points. I think the ones who understood very well how this issue of religion and foreign policy was working during the First Republic has been Antonio Gramsci, and I can explain you later on why. And finally, my conclusion is that there is there, because of the special case of Italy, a very interesting possible model of religious engagement in foreign policy which could be developed. But there are a number of risks for that. The lobbying of only Catholic constituencies, and I think in this risk, the left, and I conclude as a responsibility, because in order to avoid the cultural wars that are driven by this sort of ideologization of religion, the left had to keep a kind of open discussion with the so-called Catholic world. And as a base of this, I think it's very important also to have this sort of cultural left Catholic world dialogue, which in my view was also what the Democratic Party was about, within the framework also of the broader debate over between non-believers and believers. And I'll say you more later on if you ask me some questions. Thank you.
Come over to remarks. See.
So first of all, I would like to thank all the speakers because they provide us with a truly horizontal, let's say, how to look at Italian foreign policy, something to which we diplomats, let's say, are not so used because we come from a Westphalian tradition of foreign policy. So this was quite refreshing. I have a number of notes that I took during the presentation, but these are more doubts than really an answer to questions that were raised. First of all, about the cooperation to, let's say, the global south now, and the the policy of the international economic head of Italy during the last decades. One thing that really struck me is the fact that this was, in a way, framed as a bipartisan failure in the presentation of Maurizio Carbone and Lia Quartapelle. Now, I think that this is one part of the truth, because it depends on the economic cycle, and this was the real driver, in my opinion, on these different amounts of funding that were devoted to the economic development of the global south, but also this also accounts for the lack of continuity or some sort of pluriannual planning of the Italian. This is really the most striking feature. And also there is some other element like political opportunism. Now, I remember that in 2000, you see in the graph that were presented that there is a spike when you approach 2007, 2008, and there is a reason for that, because Italy was meant to chair the G8, and it was some sort of presentation of the Italian intention to be on the global scene as very proactive in terms of this kind of policy. But then you see that this had absolutely no continuity, so some sort of advertising about Italy, and this has not been good for the reputation of the country in terms of member of the international, responsible member of the international community. Then there's another problematic issue that I think is important. In the laws that were approved in 1979 and then the law in 1987, there are one similar sentence. They say basically the foreign aid is part of Italian foreign policy. And this is, I put a question mark on that. When you make foreign policy dependent of national interests, this becomes a little bit problematic in terms of how you decide what kind represent the priority countries in terms of your action and so on. And very strange, because at some point Anna-Marie Slaughter was mentioned. I had a lot of conversation with her because I was the head of the Italian small policy planning unit. She was head of the American State Department policy planning. Was bigger than the old Farnesina together. But anyway, we had some conversation on that, and it is really interesting that while we Italians were framing this issue as part of foreign policy, when Anna-Marie Slaughter did this quadriennial diplomacy and development review, she framed the issue on the opposite opposite terms, saying that if we make the difference in terms of global welfare, we are politically justified to run our other policies. So it is some sort of saying that our foreign policy is legitimizing only if we show that we really make it. And this was never the case in Italy. Then there are other issues like the debate on the creation of an independent agency that is still there this day on if this would help in creating an independent foreign policy in terms of aid, I would welcome this. But we had experience in the past, like the Fondo Aiuti Italiani, for instance, was some sort of emergency. And I'm not convinced that this was a good model to follow. So it is not about the tool that you use, but what kind of policy, consensual policy, you adopt in order to give this continuity that is lacking. Raffaele, I think we have to thank you for one important thing, because you spared us of the sentence soft power or smart power. So you framed this your approach in terms of Italy as normative power, which is completely new in terms of Italian foreign policy, and also you brought into the scene NGOs, but also civil society organizations, which is a more accurate description of what these groups and organizations really are. Now, about the coalitions, I had one direct experience of this death penalty issue, because I was at that point spokesperson of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and so I had to also to face questions from journalists and so on, and also requests from the very organization you mentioned, Andolf Caino, Sant'Egidio, Amnesty International Italy, to get some special visibility. So it is true that a coalition was there, but a coalition of competitors in a way, and the Italian government played the role of a sort of guarantor of the that each one's role were acknowledged in the public scene. So this is the first point. So how do you deal with competition among civil society organizations in coalition with God? And then the other issue that it's really also important is the fact that these civil society organizations used a lot the traditional and classical diplomatic power, because what they asked was to mobilize the Italian diplomatic network, embassy, consulates worldwide, to build consensus at the level of government, because at the end of the day, in the General Assembly, the delegate would vote according to instruction received by the capital. So it is an interesting mixture of social organization activity and also the involvement of diplomatic classical behavior. Rocco, well, I have some problem in accepting that Milan is the only global city. So we can say that maybe Milan is true, is the only global city, but then we have to add that Rome is the only universal city. And maybe also to add, coming from Naples, that Naples is the true pan-human city, let's say, because everything is possible in the city. So, well, I'm joking, but it is really interesting what you said about the role of expressive activities of the local municipalities, not only Milan. But this is relatively easy when you deal with consensual issues that do not affect directly the governance of the city. Expressive activities become much more difficult, as we have seen recently in the case of immigration. I had a conversation with the assessore in Milan dealing with immigration about the Syrian refugees, and this is much more complicated to handle also from the point of view of the electoral return, what kind of position you take in this situation. And also another question mark is true, Milan, a global city, Expo framed as a social forum, as you put nicely in your paper, but is that really possible to present Milan as a global city if you don't have a mosque in Milan, with a huge community of Muslims praying in the street? I just put some doubts though in this very nice complete analysis. Fabio, we had a long conversation on this topic, but I would introduce some distinction to my understanding. Italian foreign policy and religion, yes, but you have to distinguish two cases. There are cycles of Italian foreign policy in which the point of reference is the Vatican, like in the case of Andreotti, for instance. And strangely enough, in these years, the Italian foreign policy has become much more universal, let's say, and inclusive vis-à-vis the Middle East. When you bring in, instead of the Vatican, the Italian Catholic Church, it is a completely different story. So the horizon becomes much more narrow, and there is no real articulation. I think happened in some recent phase of the Italian history in terms of foreign policy. So you frame the projection of Italy in the Middle East in terms of protection of Christians, for instance, which is really damaging also for the Christians who work in this area, because the first thing that they ask, please recognize us as citizens. We are not the agent of foreign power. So, and now with the new Pope, it becomes much more interesting because it's less and less linked to the Italian political scene and much more open, as we have witnessed just yesterday with this a very interesting, if not historical, meeting in the Vatican Gardens. And another interesting thing, and I will stop here, is when you mentioned that Christianity and Catholicism is becoming more and more global. And so post-Western, a post-Western religion in a way. And this is really challenging also from the point of view of the Italian foreign policy, because this is my personal opinion. Of course, I'm talking here in my personal capacity. But my impression is that Italy did not come yet to terms with the global shift of power, for many reasons. Because we were used to the old G8, we were one of 8. We accepted the G20 as male minore, so we had to embark in this new format. But still, we are not able, as a country, as a society, as a political system, to understand to which direction the world is changing. And I always mention 2 cases. One is the case of the extradition of Cesare Battisti from Brazil, and the other one is the case, of course, the Italian Navy Marines in India. Now, I'm not mentioning the details of this story that are completely different, but what seems really an element of connection between these 2 cases, the fact that Italy is struggling, trying to understand how to deal with this country that really are reasserting their sovereignty. They are sovereign powers, first and foremost, and how we consider them in their new capacity. So this is a question mark that also to do with the understanding of the role of religion as a post-Western, or Catholicism as a post-Western religion.
We have very few minutes for questions. I suggest we have 3 questions in a row. Please identify your name and institution.
Yes, Jean-Pierre Darnis, University of Nice and Institute of International Law. A global comment on all the. I think it's quite interesting that everybody use foreign policy. Also speaking about NGOs, the civil society, I mean non-state actors or cities, which theoretically might leave some debate. You know, is it really what we could call classic foreign policy or not? But there is kind of a common comprehensive approach. That's the first point I want to stress. Then several things came in mind. I mean, very rich and very interesting. All the points that you made. On Milan, first question: Did you inquire the relation with foreign minister, with the diplomacy of state, and did you ask about the coordination? Because you gave a very impressive presentation of Milan as an international actor through the expo. Okay, but then you put the state a bit on the side, saying some negative things. Did you inquire that? Because probably it should be inquired both on personal links, political links, and then on administrative links through foreign affairs and about the other things, I have some question about the regional level. In the constituency of civil organizations, NGOs, I had somehow the impression of strong mobilization in some regions, where you have some NGOs really deeply rooted on a local basis, acting globally. Am I wrong? Did you inquire that both for the development side, and I would say more on the evaluation of all Italian action towards the world, foreign policy, I would say, evolves. And finally, for the same thing for the religion side, I think that would be very interesting to see for example, in African countries where the Comboniani missionaries and the Nuncio Apostolico and the diplomacy and ENI representative talk together and interact as a very fluid and interesting local model. It can really, I think, as far as I've talked to people, change from one country to another. But nevertheless, it's really original. Thank you.
We have Professor Pasquino.
Yeah. The question is for Partito. I think you were dealing with religion, meaning Catholicism, correct? Then you were dealing with Catholicism, meaning perhaps the Vatican, perhaps the bishops, but then perhaps you also have to deal with the Catholics in politics. That is, those who have supported or who have produced the foreign policy. Then, at the end of all this, can you focus on some decisions, some policies, some changes that have really been affected by Catholicism in terms of foreign policy?
We have a third person. Yeah, the first. Yeah.
Fabrizio Codicchia, Scuola Sant'Anna Pisa. Few questions for Leah and Maurizio. It's really interesting the lack of difference between left and right. And you say that there is a bipartisan failure, but probably failure especially for the left. If you look at the attitudes of the voters, if you look at electoral platforms where the development cooperation is one of the few common elements between the radical parties and the other senior parties, and also the role of NGOs and organizations traditionally linked with left, like ACI and the others. I don't know if it's an element of a budget, of constraints related to the economy, or a true constituency, because these two elements are, you'll find these two elements also, for instance, regarding defense. But in defense issues, there is a difference in terms of the behavior of central-left government and central-right government for the military expenditures. That the central-left take more expenses in the last 10 or 15 years. So I don't know what are these the key elements also in comparison to other issues. I try to give you just a couple of suggestions, probably silly suggestions to focus on the difference, the role of regions. You'll find differences concerning, for instance, Toscana and Lombardia, traditionally managed by central-left and central-right, not only in terms of resources, but also in terms of approach. The links with countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, and others, role of partnership. So I think there is room for analyzing the difference in decentralized cooperation. Now, and the last point is about the link between NGOs, development cooperation, and Italian defense. The behavior of NGOs when a military crisis occurred in the last 10, 15 years, if you compare the behavior of NGOs in the case of Lebanon, in the case of Iraq, in the case of Balkan, in the crisis in Balkans, when there was a central-left government, NGOs provided a lot of support in the case of Lebanon, in the case of Balkans, in the case of Iraq was completely different. Probably is a room to analyze another type of difference here. Then I have a question for Raphael later. I think there's
okay, now we have a first round of answers, and then we come.
All right.
No.
Non
lo so, qual è l'ordine?
Okay, we'll go there. We'll turn at least our head. For Pasquale, lack of okay. Yeah, because I might tell you if I come here, I'll talk for a long time. That's why I didn't to come here. See, that was a topic. Lack of funding. The literature says that it's not necessarily that we're going to test that on the Italian case. The literature says that it's not necessarily lack of funds, but it's much more, because that has been used as an excuse by governments not to raise the level of foreign aid. By reality, what we need to measure is the GNP per capita. So if we have an increase in GNP per capita, then we can have more foreign aid. It has nothing to do with lack of funds, with public deficit. The second thing that we need to look at is the level of unemployment. So those are divided. The more unemployed people you have, the less likely the government is going to spend on foreign aid, rather than the lack of funds. The lack of funds, my conclusion is that it's much more an excuse. Political opportunism, I completely agree with you. In fact, what you have, and that's measured in some of the schemes we have, and I think Elisabetta she owns the copyright for the expression, if I'm not mistaken. Italy has used a lot of catering diplomacy. And the catering diplomacy is the kind of diplomacy which has been used to host events in places like Genoa and L'Aquila, and only on those occasions, strangely enough, from the center-right, in both cases, you had a sort of increase in foreign aid just ahead of the summits. But then all the engagements that were taken in those two occasions were not, all the promises were not met. So that was what we would say. Development, sorry, I have to make a joke. Finally, I do understand about the Fondo Aiuti Italiani that did not do extremely well, but fortunately or unfortunately, some people will not like this. We no longer have the socialists in power. So that's a little joke which may be allowed in the room. So fine, an independent agency, the creation of an independent agency may be problematic. For the bipartisan, well, Fabrizio, yeah, let's think about it, because the literature says, so I'm sorry, because we still have the exploratory stage, so the literature says that the existence of NGOs, the more NGOs are independent from public funding, the more they can exercise power over the government policy. In Italy, Italian development policy, that's my understanding, that's not the case. Maybe your understanding defense policy is the case. So what do we say? The NGOs cannot play an autonomous role or cannot hold the government to account because they do not have access to their own funds. In the UK, it's much more different because much of the money from NGOs comes from private sources rather than government. So that's why you have this situation in which the Italian NGOs is not, the Italian NGO community in development, I don't know defense, to be honest, but in development it doesn't seem to be that strong. I know you want to interact with me.
Can I explain also the different terms of the behavior?
Not to me.
Or say Raffaele before, the more not so cooperative behavior of other NGOs working on norms and other issues.
You can talk.
We can talk about later. The same thing we can talk about as well as regions. For me, regions are a problem in development cooperation. They're not something positive in on development cooperation. But just Leah wants to add a couple of things because Leah has been involved in the drafting of the government bill, more or less for the reform, more or less, and about the reform of the law of Italian development cooperation. So she wants to say something about the independent agency, briefly.
I actually want to add three things. First of all, one on the economic cycle. Of course, we all know that the economic cycle is a problem, but I mean, it's not an outlier. We've had problems since 1996. So it's a matter of how politics deal with it and what responds to it, rather than being a factor that affects 1 year. All throughout the period we analyzed, there has been a problem in public finance. So this is the first thing. Second thing on regions, it really recalls me what Rocco was saying. There is a question that comes to my mind. We have a kind of a bipartisan fail or whatever at national level, but maybe at regional level or at city level, you see differences in left and right. So this is something that really we should think about it. And the third thing about the agency, I mean, all the effort that is being made is to have an agency that works, but within a coherent framework of development policies. So, and this probably is the biggest legacy that a left-wing government can leave, at least a framework of coherence.
Challenge.
Very quickly.
No more money.
Pasquale, thank you very much for your comments. I think they are very important. Of course, yeah, I was talking about cooperation between civil society and government, But of course, this is politics, so it is competition. It is competition between civil society and the government at times, and especially among competition. Yes. And the case of death penalty is particularly evident. I mean, the competition between the three actors that we know. Yes, of course, they have used also intergovernmental methods. I mean, but this is the idea, I mean, connecting to the idea, what is foreign policy? I mean, foreign policy is by now part, I mean, it's a much larger game. I mean, it's a game of global politics. If you want to play the game of foreign policy, you need to engage with non-state actors. So in that sense, that to me, I mean, is large in the scope. And of course, if you want to achieve some aims, you need also to pass through intergovernmental channels. In the case of the UN, it's obvious, but it's not enough. It's not sufficient. Of course, you need to sort of develop other kinds of actions that are related more to the public, more to non-governmental actors. I mean, you have to kind of having this kind of pluralist repertoire of action. I mean, in which you have different kinds of at different levels. Of course, playing locally, I mean, the local constituency, the fact that they were in Rome, it's very important. At the same time, sometimes it's more widespread. I mean, I'm thinking, for instance, the coordinamento degli enti locali per la pace. I mean, in that it is more nationally spread. Locally, nationally, at the European level, very important in all of these campaigns, except for the campaign for the peace in Mozambique, and at the international level, global level, the UN. So it's really the ability to navigate and to balance and the scale shift of the mobilization, the campaign among these different levels that really matter. I would stop here and leave the ground to you.
Fast, as fast as Matteo Renzi.
Togli la giacca.
On the first question, which was, I will not get into the debates on Rome and Milan, it was a mistake just to get started. And Naples, of course. No, on the question of the mosque is indeed a very blatant case. It's a blatant case for several reasons. First of all, of course, there is still no mosque left, no mosque there, and so in this sense, there's clearly has been a failure by the centre-left administration, which promised it and made it a big part of its electoral campaign. On the other hand, I have to admit there is a clear change in attitude in the way they are working with both the local Muslim community and foreign countries like Morocco or Jordan, and in this sense, it really gets to my point of saying there is a difference between the center-left and center-right in Milan, how they dealt with this nexus between the international and the local, and how they tried, at least in this case they have not succeeded yet, but to make Milan a more global city and to keep in mind this international dimension and how it feeds into the local level. On the second very interesting question, which of course is the coordination between the city and the foreign ministry, it's a disaster. There is no coordination whatsoever. The officials in Milan resent it very much, and they sometimes there is also a diverging path in the sense that, for instance, Italy had very close relationship with Russia, and Milan was breaking its city twining with St. Petersburg. Italy was starting to have a line on the Muslim Brotherhood, and city councillors in Milan had a completely different idea on the Muslim Brotherhood when again on the debate on the mosque, which in a sense it also gets in the point of expressive activities. I mean, the national government and the foreign ministry also during Monti government, I would say, was kind of a center-right foreign ministry. The line, in some case, the city was also trying to kind of propose an alternative vision of foreign policy. The foreign ministry, there is no cooperation, I was saying, but then at times when the city kind of gets in the dangerous area, then they intervene. They intervene very top-down from above. The visit of the Dalai Lama was the most clear case. At some point, the city of Milan was going to confer the honorary citizenship to the Dalai Lama in his visit in Milan. Then China, of course, threatened repercussion also on the Expo, and then the line was clearly given from Rome, forget the honorary citizenship. And in this sense, I think there is so clearly lots of naive attitude on the part of the officers in Milan, and in this sense, I'm saying that it's the beginning of a process of cooperation in foreign policy between different local bodies, and there is clearly a long way to go.
I just add to this. No, there is one small thing. There's one institutional way of responding to this lack of coordination. Sometimes big cities and mayors of these cities have asked for the secondment of a professional diplomat to work as a diplomatic advisor to the municipality. Not because the municipality has not enough resource, intellectual and professional resources, but because this guy works exactly as a liaison officer with the Farnesina and can mobilize also the global network. So just
this of course has been done with the Expo Society, yeah, which has a seconded diplomats, of course, you know, because again the Expo is that part, is that crucial part that the foreign ministry immediately claimed as saying this is too serious for you to
we can continue again in the coffee break. For Fabio.
Yeah, I joined Pasquale Ferrara's comment with Professor Pastino's question. I think let me give you because probably I was too too unclear about that. But let me give you an example of how I think religion, and particularly in this case Catholicism, can actually influence the Italian foreign policy through some, for example, in different ways. I mean, I think there are many different ways. Pasquale has pointed very well how, for example, there was the influence of the Vatican on Italian foreign policy. And I think here, with just one short, Henry Kissinger used to say, when you speak with Andreotti, you never know whether you are talking to the Minister of Italy or the Foreign Affairs Minister of the Vatican. That's one of the kind of joke he used there, but there was a deep truth in that. And that, just speaks to the fact that, of course, through Andreotti, there was, a kind of fluidity between the Vatican visions of international politics and Italian foreign policy. Now, this is different. It takes different forms when it's the Italian Catholic Church, as you mentioned. I mean, here I think we are coming out of a number of years in which, as you mentioned, there was a very specific alliance between some part of the ecclesiastical Italian hierarchy on issue, for example, of freedom of religion and attitudes towards Islam, which sometimes, put in some cases, Italy in difficult positions vis-à-vis the Muslim wars. I mean, I just want to remind, the very spectacular baptism of Mahdi Allah. Yes. That was something which didn't pass unobserved in many parts of the Muslim world. And of course, was very much pushed by the Italian hierarchy and some sector of Italian hierarchy. Now, but another way, and here I go to Raffaele, in which the Catholic, in this case, Catholic civil society had the major impact on Italian foreign policy was the peace deal in Mozambique. I mean, that was a terrible civil war which killed more than 2 million people, and it was a productive, in this case, interaction between, with tensions, but deeply, I think Sant'Egidio couldn't have done it without the support of Farnesina and vice versa, and that helped to strike a deal which has brought back Mozambique to peace, and that's a very serious output of foreign policy. Finally, and I think that's not about the Catholic Church only. When we talk about first of all, the religious scene of Italy is changing. Italy is a much more religiously pluralistic country nowadays. It's a much more secular country. Yeah, the Muslim communities are much more present. There are other religions. It's a much more also secular country. But what is important is that actually we need to understand that this sort of global geopolitical shift we're talking about is not only economics, it's military, it's about ideologies. And this ideological change in many parts of the world has something to do with religions. And if you want to be serious about understanding this ideological change, we need to actually understand religion. I mean, India, now there will be again, has anyone commented on the ideological nature of the PGP and the National Hindus Party? We can't do business with them as usual. I mean, they have a kind of different worldviews, and we need to understand what's also the religious inspired worldviews from which they're coming about. just to give an example.
Thank you. Let's thank all the speakers. And
Coffee is outside.
Coffee is outside, and the next group will be at 3 o'clock. I think I'll be my student presenting the other Yeah, I missed it before. The last late
Dipende, no, dipende un po' dal tema. Quindi parliamo un pochettino, cioè o è un tema molto politico, o appunto questa cosa qui, plurale, tipo questo panel, ovviamente. Se mi fai un tema più storico, quello io lì non sono interessato.
You know when you give graduate things, and I'm pretty sure you also added to the internal matrix, so no matter, it doesn't matter, you can keep sending reminders and stuff. I sent you the link, officially it's not yet released, so I don't have this PDF, so this is really, but anyway, it was, no, but basically, it's fascinating because of the richness of the data, but it was conducted in the summer 2012, it was filmed. So with everything that happened since last July, the data about Egypt, it's like
Sai cos'è una storia che anche marca, che è molto importante, che adesso sta un po' facendo tutto c'è un nuovo governo di comunicazione in genere, Thatcher, Reagan negli anni 80. Invece c'è una storia socialista europea degli anni 90, socialisti francesi, tedeschi, ma anche italiani, Amato, Prodi della Commissione un po' più tardi naturalmente. E allora questo secondo me è una cosa un po' interessante da ricostruire, cioè che poi spiega poi perché oggi la sinistra è pro-integrazione europea, che significa anche pro-integrazione dei mercati e tutto il resto. Quella è una storia che viene dagli anni 90, perché noi in genere pensiamo che la globalizzazione è una cosa neoliberista di destra. Attenzione, negli anni 90 i socialisti hanno pensato di dare una risposta alla globalizzazione multilateralizzando le regole, ma regole sempre liberali. Quindi in una botta solo hanno moltiplicato la cosa. È una storia che stanno iniziando a raccontare alcuni molto bravi e secondo me sarebbe carino fare qualcosa anche un po' sull'Italia, perché secondo me Amato, tutti questi Ciampi anche, Prodi, è una storia interessante da raccontare.
Ma lui ne parlava prima proprio esattamente di questo punto con Bosco, che è uno storico che lui non si occupa assolutamente degli anni 90, più nel senso degli anni 60, arriva fino agli anni 60. Però mi diceva questo, il centro-sinistra adesso è l'amministrazione degli oligopolisti.
Certo. Beh, ma appunto negli ultimi 20 anni,
esatto.
E se tu senti Tremonti lo dice, e però nessuno lo sta a sentire, però è terribile perché Tremonti lo dice, questi a sinistra, questi sono quelli che hanno fatto il capo, perché lui adesso è diventato, sai, i libri che ha scritto un libro, La paura, cioè lui è anti-globalizzazione, almeno a livello retorico, poi in pratica. E lui dice questo è la sinistra.
Cioè, esatto, la sinistra. Ma giustamente, ma anche come qua. Cioè, nel senso, il New Labour è stato
certo, poi c'è Blair e poi c'è Clinton, insomma. Però ecco, c'è tutta una parte che è anche americana ma è molto europea, socialista e quindi anche italiana. Magari non proprio un ruolo di leadership, però certamente hanno messo il loro e hanno accettato, contribuito e adottato la linea. Vabbè, quella è anche una storia interessante un po' da raccontare. Sì, quella. No, ma che lui secondo me non la sa. Cioè, non la sa, non la vuole raccontare. È anche una storia che non si racconta, eh? Cioè, c'è una certa resistenza politica a raccontare questa storia.
Quelle chiavi
sono mie, adesso le racconto. Ok, allora magari parliamone un po' stasera anche con Maurizio. Gli diciamo un po' di cose e poi si tratta di mettere assieme un proposal e vabbè, comunque insomma. Quindi può essere.
Un giorno prima.
E appunto se si fa politica, allora certamente io inviterei qualcuno un punto di vista da fuori.
Esatto, un cambio, una cosa che ti dica quella storia lì, che ti racconti quella storia lì.
E nei confronti dei giornalisti.
E poi se invece appunto pluralizziamo un pochettino, allora è anche capire appunto